One of the reasons for being concerned about just war theory is being able to explain why terrorism isn't war. And more to the point for most arguments, why terrorism is unacceptable, though war can be. Khachadourian suggests that all terrorism is wrong. He offers 4 classifications of terrorism, but in the end turns to just war theory and concludes all terrorism is wrong. Now, Khachadourian proposes that terrorism is a term like murder that only applies to wrongdoing. We usually refer to the definition of murder being immoral homicide. Terrorism, he wants to suggest perhaps, is an illegitimate form of war, a war that is not justified in the way it's carried out, nor justified in its existence at all. As I say, he proposes 4 classifications. Let's take a moment and list each one so we can understand exactly why he offers his critique. First of all, he talks about predatory terrorism. This is terrorism that's carried out for the sake of gaining monetarily. Perhaps it's something you've done for hire. Perhaps it's something you do to bring back goods or money. But it's a violence that's done purely for the sake of the monetary reward. He also talks about retaliatory terrorism, where terrorism is carried out for the sake of getting revenge or some kind of redress for some wrongdoing or perceived wrongdoing. Now, there is political terrorism, which is carried out when there's been no successful outcome in a political arrangement. You feel like you're underrepresented in the government or your causes aren't listened to. So you're carrying out terrorism as a violent means of forwarding your political agenda. And then there is moral terrorism. Moral terrorism is the idea that something has been done morally wrong. Okay, now let's talk about some differences here. We mentioned retaliatory. Well, retaliatory could be something as simple as you blew up my car, now I'm going to blow up your car. And blowing up cars is probably a moral period, but nevertheless, that's not a moral reaction. That's just you blew up mine, I'm blowing up yours. You did this to me, I do this to you. I hit Krakow, Krakow hits me. That's all. Political terrorism is centered around this idea of forwarding a political agenda. And not all political agendas are rooted in morality. We could only be interested in protecting the pathway of a pipeline or defending our heritage in this area so that we carry out violence not because of something we see as morally wrong as much as it is something that we politically want to protect. Moral wrongs may be tied to anything from violations of trust to wrongdoings against individuals that we see no other way to set straight than violence. And Khachadourian says of all of these, none can be justified as acts of war, and thus they are terrorism. First, he says terrorism violates the distinction between civilian and soldier, between combatant and innocent bystander. Terrorism, in fact, normally targets innocent bystanders. I put it in scare quotes because it is argued elsewhere that there are no such thing as innocent bystanders, that everyone is always tied up in the political doings of the community in which they're in, whether they are intentionally so tied up or not. But Khachadourian says, no. There are people who are not involved. They are not involved. They are innocent. And when terrorism targets that kind of person, that kind of situation, it just shows you how wrong it is. Since, after all, war cannot be just when it targets bystanders who are not involved in combat. Also talking about proportionality. Again, if you look back at what I've said on my Aquinas video on just war, Aquinas says, look, you have to have a just cause. What are you trying to do? And when we're talking here about proportionality, we're worried about are we carrying out something that's legitimate? Or we could look back at what Kant has to say about a war. When we're working toward this idea of perpetual peace, he says, well, you can't have wars then that are dirty. Dirty wars are not permissible. And these two principles we're talking about here violate those rules as well. The outcome of a war has to be something good if it's to be a just war. If all we're trying to do is get revenge, all we're trying to do is steal money, all we're trying to do is, not pay attention to the old adage that two wrongs don't make a right, then we're simply doing something wrong, immoral, and there is no defense of it. Now, the one theory he doesn't address it up front is what he refers to as revolutionary terrorism. He inherits this term. He says of it, it misses the point still, that if it's truly a revolution, if it's truly an attempt to regroup the political structure of the community, then it's not terrorism. If it's just an attempt to disrupt the status quo, then it's immoral, just as any other attempt to destroy without replacing with good. See, that's the key. War should always be trying to give us a better outcome than we went in with, that the situation at the end will be improved. If not, then it's not a just war. And as I suggest, it could well be that that is the best of all definitions of terrorism, is simply that it's an unjust war. Now, the one other thing that terrorism tends to do is not be a source of real government activity. We hear talk about state-sponsored terrorism. What I think Khachadourian would want to say is, no. That's just simply an illegitimate war. That's not terrorism at all. Revolution, just as revolutionary terrorism, if it's a real revolution, isn't terrorism, and if it's real terrorism, then it's not a revolution. Okay. Interestingly enough, it wasn't too hard to find articles that argue in favor of terrorism. One of the people writing for terrorism, trying to vindicate it, is Robert Young, whose article on revolutionary terrorism Khachadourian tries to respond to. Young's position is simply this: when you reach a point where you cannot find any other way to convince the government that they should be doing something, you are forced to take arms. His examples, well, he has several contemporary examples, but ultimately, of course, he's referring back to the American Revolution. That's why revolutionary terrorism. If violence is all that can get the job done, now you have to try everything else first, but if violence is all you can do to get the job done, and the job is one that should be done, so we're, again, not trying to we'd like to have soda on Tuesdays. That's not good enough. It's got to be something that's a meaningful change necessary for the social structure of the community to be more just, more fair, more moral. If that's the case, then he says revolution is justified. Now, Angelo Corlett wants to argue that it is possible to conduct moral terrorism. The traditional objection that it attacks the innocent Well, he just wants to say there's no such thing as a guarantee that no one will ever attack you, whoever you may be. And the fact that they do attack you doesn't necessarily mean that what they're doing is immoral, especially in light of what might be their motivating factors. Corlett wants to propose this definition of terrorism, that it is an attempt to achieve or prevent some political or social or economic or religious change by the actual or threatened use of violence, aimed partly at destabilizing the situation, making it more likely that the desired outcome of the terrorist action will come about, or at least get those who are in power to change their position. And again, he just simply wants to say, we've tried everything else. And the only thing these people will listen to is a gun pointed at their head. And so we've turned to terrorism. The one great thing everyone says is, well, you're bringing non-combatants in. So no one is guaranteed safety. No one is guaranteed unequivocally, unarguably, that nobody will ever do you violence. Even violence you may not perceive the need for. Do these justifications for terrorism work? Well, I'm going to leave that open for your discussion, and I hope you'll have some discussion. I hope you'll spend some time thinking about this, thinking about some of the examples offered that I've given to you today. Everything from the American Revolution right straight through to the liberation of British Mandate Palestine from the United Kingdom's rule. Think about them. Think about what that says about the rest of the world now that we have to deal with. Talk about it. Talk about it amongst yourselves. Talk it amongst your friends. Talk it up here. Keep talking philosophy.